This is Roberta Foster, and welcome to today's edition of the Author's Corner, brought to you by KNEO 91.7 FM The Word. And today I welcome Laurel Shaler to Author's Corner. She and Gary Chapman have written the book Loving Adopted Children Well, a 5 love language approach, which is published by Northfield Publishing. And she'll tell you more about how to find the book at the end of the program. Let me tell you a little bit about our authors. Gary Chapman is not with us today, but he is an author, speaker, and counselor with a passion for helping people form lasting relationships. He is the #1 best-selling author of the 5 Love Languages series and director of Marriage and Family Life Consultants Incorporated. And then Dr. Laurel Shaler, who's with us today, is a national certified counselor, licensed marriage and family therapist, licensed professional counselor, and licensed social worker. She's also a professor at Liberty University in the Department of Counselor Education and Family Studies. She's the author of Relational Reset, Unlearning the Habits That Hold You Back, and Reclaiming Sanity, Hope and Healing for Trauma, Stress, and Overwhelming Life Events. And Dr. Laurel, it's sure a pleasure having you with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Delighted to be here.
And so why don't you tell us how you and Dr. Gary Chapman developed the idea of a book on the topic of loving adopted children well?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Well, first of all, it comes about from my own personal experience with adoption. My husband and I have 3 children by adoption, 2 by traditional adoption, and 1 by embryo adoption. And our littlest love is only 4 months old.
Oh.
So she was born just about a month before this book was published. But several years ago, I was talking with Dr. Chapman's acquisitions editor. I had written another book with Moody, and I was at a conference, and I was chatting with him and sharing this idea that I had. And the idea came about because as I was kind of getting adjusted to motherhood and learning all that I could, I started reading books on parenting. And, of course, I read The Love Languages for Children that Dr. Chapman wrote with co-author Ross Campbell. And I loved the book, and I found it so helpful. And at the same time, while I was looking through the book, I would think to myself, oh, it might be helpful if right here in this spot there was an example specifically for adopted children. Or I would think, I think that there's some different challenges. Parenting is hard work. Like, we're not minimizing parenting at all, but maybe there are some different challenges that could be addressed through this through a book that's designed specifically for families who have experienced adoption as a part of their journey. And so the acquisitions editor said, hey, I this sounds like a good idea. Let me pitch it to Dr. Chapman. And he did. And then we met and talked further about the ideas and kind of got our heads wrapped around what it would look like and how it might be different from the book, 5 Love Languages for Children. And we went from there and we wrote the book.
So tell us a couple of very definite differences between the 2 books.
I can give you some specific examples from the different love languages, but before I do that, I also want to share that there are also some chapters in this book that are just unique to those that have adopted. We talk about what it looks like when parents are not on the same parenting page. We talk about sibling rivalry, looking at issues even related to, like, if you have a child that's biological and then you have a child that's not biological, what that might look like. And we talk about topics such as attachment. We address prenatal issues that might have come up. So, what may have happened to a child prior to them even being born, or how does what they experienced after they were born, how does that play a role in their personality and their development? So there are some definite differences in terms of how we look at the concept as a whole. Now, specific to some of the languages, one of the things that I'll share about is the physical touch. I frequently go to that as an example because I think it's the clearest, and so it can be super helpful to help illustrate some of the differences.
Sure.
So if you have a child that comes into your home that was neglected and didn't experience any touch, or on the other hand, you had a child that comes into your home who was abused physically, or in some other way that touch was harmful to them, they may not be somebody who is going to lean towards wanting to be touched. At the same time, we don't want to say, oh, they don't want to be touched, so let's never touch them, because that's not going to, that's going to set them up for a lifetime struggle. And we know how healing touch can be. But what we want to do is be sensitive to how we go about touching them and touch them in ways that are healthy and safe and feel good to them. And so just learning from them, thinking about something as simple as putting on a shoe for a child and how that involves some touch. And is that something that we can demonstrate? You know, yes, it's an act of service, but it's also touching them. Or if we're swinging them on the swing and we're touching their back as we're swinging them. Or as we're holding their hand across the street, and just show them ways that we can love them through touch. So I think just looking at sometimes not just the fact that how you utilize love languages might be different, but where it comes from. Like, where does the physical touch, like where does the desire to show them physical touch come from? Because we know that all children need to experience all 5 love languages. And at some point, they'll start to develop one or maybe 2 that they lean towards and that they really thrive on. So we want to start observing and paying attention to help us figure out what's going to be the best way to show each individual child love.
Well, as I was looking through your book, you talked about birthdays and how that can be something very different through an adoptive process. And it was just kind of amazing as I read it, just how surprising that can be to an adoptive parent, especially with the first child, I would imagine, because that's quite the learning curve. Just how different that can be versus a naturally born child into the family. And so share how that is something parents need to be kind of mindful of.
Yeah, I think sometimes we think, oh, this is like such a special day. Shouldn't they be so happy? But that's not always the case. And again, sometimes it depends on when the child came into your home. Maybe they have memories from their childhood that are painful. Or on the other hand, I can think of one adoptee who the only day she was really treated well was on her birthday. So in her adopted home, her birthdays made her sad, but that was the hardest day of the year for her because it was the only day that she remembered, feeling loved by her biological family. And so I think we have to just remember that a day that we might think is really exciting can be overwhelming for all different reasons. And I'll add, too, that even if a child is adopted at birth, there can still be challenges for them. All 3 of my children were adopted very young. Of course, my child who was adopted as an embryo was, grew in my womb, and I gave birth to her. And so I've been with her a long time. And then the other 2 children, one came home from the hospital with me we met him at 3 days old and took him home from the hospital at 2.5 weeks. And the other one we met at 2 months old. And her journey was a little bit different with us, but we were able to adopt her before she was a year old. And so even with them, sometimes there are days that are more challenging than others, even if it's something that you think is a special occasion. And there can just be so many different factors for why. So we have to be mindful of that and not go to this place of, oh, why aren't they being grateful? Or why don't they know that I'm doing this because I love them? Sometimes it just feels overwhelming.
Well, today I'm talking with Dr. Laurel Shaler about the book Loving Adopted Children Well, a 5 Love Languages Approach. It's published by Northfield Publishing. And you're listening to Author's Corner. I'm Roberta Foster. And if you miss any part of today's interview or would like to hear it again, you can now find it on your favorite podcast provider or through kneo.org. Dr. Shaler, do you feel there is one love language that is particularly important for children who have been adopted?
Oh, I think that's a great question. I mean, really, I think it's whichever love language they indicate makes them feel the most loved. Certainly, I think quality time is really important. You need to show them that they're valuable and that they're worth your time. And I remember when we were going through the adoption process, we didn't wind up adopting any children as a result of working with an agency, but we did work with several agencies through the process. And I remember learning that sometimes that was a factor for a birth mother who was going to place her child for adoption. Like, how much time can they really invest in this child? So just knowing that spending the time with them is going to be super meaningful. And so what I do is I try and have buddy time with my son and Bessie time with my daughter, and where it's just the two of us, and where they know that, like, they have all of my attention, and I don't have my phone, and I don't have a computer, and I'm not looking at my watch, and, I don't even have another kid with me. It's just them. Even if it's something just like last night, my son and I went and ran errands together. He wanted to come. He likes to come with me on those errands, and we just got to spend time together. Other times it might be, my daughter wants to pretend that we're mermaids, and so I get to be a mermaid or a kitty cat or whatever she wants me to be for those few moments. And it's something that really means a lot to them.
So is there something that you can share with our listeners regarding parents that may feel concerned about the bonding of perhaps an older adopted child into the family?
Yeah, that's definitely a concern. I was just talking with a couple recently who adopted a couple of children from a different country, outside of America, and the children were older, and it made it difficult. There were cultural issues and language barriers, and there's a lot of trauma that these kiddos have been through to become eligible for adoption and then to be moved out of their home country and into a new country. So we can't ever minimize the fact that there could be some attachment issues going on. In fact, there's something specific called reactive attachment disorder, which is a kind of an extreme form of a lack of bonding. Thankfully, there is help. I highly recommend that everyone who is in a situation like that pursue professional help. There's great counseling available for that. And, it's important even for the parents to get the counseling, to know that they're not alone. And that the Lord has made them the parent of that child, and we can't understand everything about that, but we do know that if that's what God intended, then He's going to see them through. But definitely focusing on our relationship with the Lord is going to be important, and getting professional help so that we can work on developing a healthy attachment with our children.
And in your book, I think you even offer a section that provides some adoption support that might be available to parents.
Yes, absolutely, because support is so important. I've been privileged to learn from parents who have been in this adoption journey longer than me, and I've tried to come alongside and mentor others and give them some tips. And even though, my children are still young, my oldest is 7, but we've been, we explored adoption for 5 years before that. It took a very long time. It's funny, as long as it took for our daughter to come home, it only took a few weeks for our son to come home. So you never know what God's plan is. But certainly you want to pray. You want to make sure that you, and if you're married, your spouse is on the same page, that you feel a calling to adopt, and that you just wait patiently on the Lord, because, He is faithful.
So today I'm talking with Dr. Laurel Shaler, who co-wrote Loving Adopted Children Well, a 5 Love Languages Approach, and it was written with Dr. Gary Chapman. So Laurel, tell our listeners how they can find out more about this book and others that you've written.
Absolutely. I'd love to invite everyone to check out my website, www.drlaurelshaler.com, or you can find this book on Amazon.com.
And one more time, the book is Loving Adopted Children Well, a 5 Love Languages Approach, written by Laurel Shaler and Gary Chapman. And we certainly thank Northfield Publishing for giving us a copy of the book to talk about. And it's been a real pleasure talking with you today, Laurel. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
And to our listeners, we appreciate you tuning in. This is Roberta Foster on the Author's Corner. Join us again next time.